It is my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to today. And just a little background for me, I'm in the business about it's going on 6 years now. I was a nuclear engineer and a nuclear power plant supervisor for almost 20 years prior. Just wanted to do something different, had a passion for personal finance. So I started a firm 6 years ago and haven't looked back since. And I just want to show, like, the past two webinars have been great. I've really enjoyed showing everybody just things that I do at the firm with regards to tax planning and how to talk to especially retirees when it comes to down markets, bear markets, things like that, and maybe help them through those really stressful times today. But so the difference is today is going to be much more of me just kind of driving through the software and less of like, here's a PowerPoint, here's a concept of this and that. It's going to be more practical. So I'm really excited about that. I really like this graphic here, and just kind of shows like the difference between your accumulation and decumulation phase, what that looks like. You're building, you're growing, you're planting the seeds, you're doing the work. And then on the second part of that life, you're kind of living off the fruit and the hard work that you did, right? So I really like how this visual, I use it with clients, of the difference. And really, this masterclass should be called Best Practices in Constructing and Presenting Retirement Income Plans, because we're definitely going to go through the constructing phase of it for sure. So just, I always start with this slide, 3 promises. I did the graphics in here. So they're not good. I'll just be honest with you, but I'm not ashamed of that. I think it's a lot more about the content of it. And I am very much being an engineer and things like that by trade originally, and a math person, not an English or spelling person. So you'll definitely see something spelled wrong, probably some grammatical mistakes. Don't judge me off of that. Let's just go with the content. Right. But one thing I want to say, like Justin and the people at Income Lab, they're the experts of the software. So this is just me showing you the way that I use it and the way that, maybe some of the tricks of the trade that I've picked up and some things to make it efficient, or, things I've A/B tested with clients and shown one set of clients one thing, one the other way, and got feedback on it on which one was better. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the way that the software is designed to be used or that it's the ideal way. It's just the way I do it. I am going to go pretty fast. There was some feedback, on I think a previous session where I was going through the software kind of fast, but that's by design, right? This isn't like necessarily meant to be a tutorial of it. It's meant to be a demo of the capability, and part of the capability is the speed at which you can create things in here and the efficiency. So I think that's important to show. Reach out to Justin and Income Lab and the team are there. Like when you sign up, you can get demos. There's a ton of videos, things like that you can watch. And I am going to highlight or at least try to, as I'm going through this presentation, I've read over all the questions that you have submitted, and I'm going to try to touch on those. A lot of them were compiled and kind of compressed into, okay, these are very similar. So, but I will go over that and I'll try to let you know when I'm answering a previous question. So I want you to know your questions are important. Please put them in there. If you're from a past webinar and your question didn't get answered, hopefully it does today. And we'll get there, right? So let's go to the software. I think that's the best way to jump in. Please stop me if you don't see Justin, if you don't see the Income Lab software, but if you see the Income Lab software, this is great. And I just kind of want to show you, I debated whether or not to just make a full plan in front of you. For time purposes, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to go through it in probably the same speed that you could make it. Right. So I made this is just a hypothetical family, the retirees. Right, that's their last name. We've got Dave and Diane, retiree. They want to retire right now. They're like, okay, I've had enough. I'm done working. Work is not as fun as it used to be. Things are changing. The new policies, I'm not agreeing. So tell me, if they walk in my office and say, tell me what it looks like if I retire, and my first month of retirement is January 2025. So you can see this is kind of where you start off your plan, and you can name it whatever you want. You can put descriptions. The descriptions are for you, so you can add more details. The clients that you have, the state, right? And I'll kind of give you a little one of these when I'm answering a previous question. Yes, the state in here does matter because it does incorporate some state tax info. So that's answered a previous webinar question. And then when you want to retire, right? And that's kind of the basics, right? Now, of course, you would have already put in, if you're creating a household, you would see the up here, you would see the name, the birthday and male female, and the male female is used for like longevity purposes and things like that, right? So then moving over to assets, we've got their investment accounts. I just kept it very simple. These numbers, like not realistic being round numbers and all, but just to keep it easy. So in here, you can select what type of account it is, which is important. You name the account. And then over here, the little gear, you can change some settings, right? You can change kind of how it's invested from an aggression standpoint, aggressive, moderate, conservative, and some places in between. See that slide scale? These are just the risk-based defaults. They come with Income Lab. You can go custom, or you can build your own and use your own, right? And then you can look at the distribution settings as well. You can kind of, answer some questions as to whether you can use the rule of 55 and somebody could take directly from their 401k if they leave it in their employer plan. Do we want to exclude anything from Roth conversion, so on and so forth. So you've got some great settings in here that you can change. All right. If we go to next, we go to annuities. I don't have an annuity in here for this, but we are going to touch on that a little later in the presentation. I didn't put bank accounts or anything like that just for simplicity. And a lot of what you're doing right now is you may just be building like some retirement plan options for a prospective client or a client who's just now onboarding. So you're like trying to just getting started. So I like to think of, and I use this reference as cheesy as it is with my clients, as a retirement plan is a nice sculpture. Right now we're using the chainsaw. Eventually we're going to get to the chisel, and eventually we're going to get to some other more detailed tools. But we are chainsawing the ice right now to get an idea, and we will improve it as time goes on. It takes a couple meetings in my process to get through and get a workable plan for a retiree, because I think it deserves that and it's that important. As far as income, you've got your Social Security. You can enter it in here in a couple different ways. You can estimate. You can use, I just like to put in at full retirement age, and then you can extrapolate really easy down here using these sliding scales. And then if somebody's actually drawing Social Security, you can actually just select this manual right here, put that in. And just for Social Security, here's how I like to say it is, we're gonna, unless they had strong feelings one way or another, say, this client's retiring at 59. You're a couple years away from even being able to draw Social Security. We're gonna have an entire meeting just to talk about that. And in fact, I kind of developed this nerdy formula that comes up with like, what's our best guess, our best estimate, best probability for your Social Security filing. There's no way to tell what the best decision is unless you look at it in hindsight. But let's look at this formula. You've got life expectancy, current health, marital status. Do you have a pension? What's your risk tolerance? All these things matter. So I use this formula when I'm kind of determining that, but that's just a value add for clients saying, hey, we're going to look at this very in depth when you turn 61 and a half. And then maybe we'll make a decision to file early, maybe later. Maybe we'll make a decision to defer, but reevaluate it every 6 months, which is typically where I end up with clients. Let's look at it every 6 months to see if anything has changed in your life where we should file earlier. So just a little tidbit on Social Security. Dave, retiree, does have a small pension from a previous job. You do kind of want to go over here and select and just make sure, most pensions don't have an inflation adjustment, so make sure you turn that off. You can start it at whatever date you want, whether it be they have to take it at a certain age. You can start it at retirement, all the above, right? You can make it exempt from state tax, things like that. Different states have different. And then the survivorship down here, you can change, right? I am buzzing through all these kind of fast. Like I said, not a tutorial. I just want to tell you kind of what I'm looking at when I'm building a plan. All right. And then they do have a mortgage. So they have a mortgage of about $1,800 a month that's going to end in 2034. They are currently saving in their Roth IRAs and 401ks and things like that. And we've got that monthly amount in here. And of course, you can change that, whether that's going to go up with inflation, when that's going to stop, things like that. But in all, this doesn't matter too much for this plan because they're retiring like really soon, or at least they want to. They want to know where they're at, right? So if we go ahead and we run that plan, it's going to come back and it's going to show us some things, right? What it's looking at, and it's using, Income Lab's magic formula, which Justin can talk to you about in much more intelligently than I can, to come up with, okay, what's a reasonable spending capacity, meaning a reasonable amount we can spend, and start off where there's a chance that we'll have to make pay cuts, because if there's no chance you have to take a pay cut, then you're probably starting way too low. But not an overwhelming chance that we're going to, overspend, where you'd have to take a bunch of pay cuts. Also, not an overwhelming chance you're going to underspend, where you're going to end up with a whole lot of money at the end of life. So that's really important. That's really the philosophy of Income Lab, and the importance of what I like to show people is here's your standard inflation adjusted spending path, 4% rule type of spending. You start spending a particular amount, you adjust it for inflation every year from the day you retire to the day you die. Unfortunately, no one spends money like that, nor do they want to. This makes a lot more sense. Spend a little more early, flatten out in the middle, spend less at the end, except for a tail up, usually when somebody has a health / long-term care issue. We're going to talk about that. And that way you don't end up in the regret zone where you're in your mid 70s, 80s, you look back and say, man, I really wish I would have took those trips. Wish I would have, took the grandkids to Disney World or wherever. I say that, I just got back last week, so not grandkids though. So if you see, what this does is it gives you an allowable income of $8,900 a month after taxes, right? So you can see projected income, other expenses, that's the mortgage, gross income, estimated taxes, and then net income right there. This also shows on the main screen, but you do have to be cognizant of there are many settings over here that you'll want to be aware of, because this number doesn't match the one I just showed you. You're like, why doesn't it match? Well, number one, is it in real or nominal dollars? And that's going to change more drastically the further away the retirement is. Is it an annual or monthly? Is it pre-tax or net of tax? And do you have variable expenses on there or not, which would be their mortgage, right? So if you want to show someone, hey, if this is what your after tax is going to be after your mortgage is paid, that's a great way to show them. If you want to show them, here's your after tax before your mortgage is paid, so like this is the amount that's actually going to be deposited into the plan, then, or into the bank account, then that's going to be this number. So it's a really good tool to move around and find out what type of communication works for that client. They like to think of it after tax. I think most people do. It's apples to apples from them when they were working. Do they like to think of it if my mortgage is gone? I think all those things are really important, right? So when I'm presenting the plan, I'm going through a very important concept, I think, to cover is that Income Lab, and I think rightfully so, is planning for level income. And I don't need level income forever, like to get the same income forever, but a lot of clients feel like they're going to get a raise when they file for Social Security. And my counter to that is, why would you want to wait till 67 or 70 or whenever you might file to get a couple thousand or multiple $1,000 a month raise when you're already 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, who knows how long into retirement? Why not spread that out? And in anticipation of that inflation adjusted income source coming later, then why not spend more early? That's the whole point, right? Also, it's not like when the mortgage is paid off that you get a raise either, right? You're maintaining the same net of mortgage income. You can see right here, this drop off, right? Drops off when the mortgage goes away, and they still have the same lifestyle because they dropped in income, but they also dropped in expenses, right? So that's a really, you have to, sometimes I do notice I have to go over this with clients a couple times so they become comfortable with the idea of level income. They still kind of come back to the fact, well, that's not even counting Social Security. Well, yes, it is, right? Because we're planning that you do not get a raise when you get Social Security. You just kind of seamlessly move into there. You're taking less from your investments, more from Social Security, but your income kind of stays the same, right? You can dig in a little deeper into expenses and taxes and things like that. I'm not going to do that for this webinar. And then I think something really important is the settings that you get over here. And we're definitely going to touch on these a little more, but I just kind of want to show you, like, as you're presenting these plans, this is, for me, if I'm showing the retirees this plan, is the base case. We'll call it like, this is the most simple, most likely very appropriate for somebody who just walked in the door, a prospective client. Definitely not detailed enough for an actual retiree though, but we're going to get there, right? This is literally the first chainsaw on the ice. So then where do we go from here? Like, what can we adjust? And you can see there's ways to adjust the income setting. There's ways to adjust longevity. There's ways to adjust all kind of things in here. And there's whether you want to assess those traits via a conversation, via some type of assessment, things like that. I personally use an assessment called the RISA. I think it's great. I think it aligns with Income Lab great. It's got all kind of questions on front loading versus back loading, accumulation versus distribution, how important is legacy to you, lifestyle, liquidity, longevity, all those things. But you could literally just ask those questions. Really, for me, this is data gathering upon which I will confirm in a meeting. Right? So that's where it starts to get a little interesting, in that when you can start to change these things, right? And this is where the customization comes in. So you'll start with a base plan like this, and as you get to know the prospective client, or somebody becomes a client, they're like, okay, let's really start to dig into this retirement thing. What can you change it here? So you can change longevity. A lot of that's based on things that we can't predict, but we can make some reasonable assumptions, I'll call it with. You could ask them about their family history, health issues that they're comfortable talking about, and things like that. Or you can have them take, there's a lot of different calculators. Here's one that's interesting. It's called the Living to 100 calculator. You put in all kinds of things about your history and your health and stuff like that, and it gives you a number. Now, we all know that that number is probably not going to be the number, but at least it gives an idea. Another part of the conversation is clients may say, I don't know how long I'm going to live, but I'm comfortable planning to this age, which I think is really important, right? If a client has a really high Social Security, they were a higher income earner, they have a large pension, might be a government pension that has an inflation adjustment, they might not care if they're down to only fixed income sources at a particular age, 92, 95, who knows, right? So are some settings that you can change in here to be able to customize that for the client. So the interesting thing is here, once I make a base plan, this is where I start, right? And then next I'm going to say, okay, let's talk about adding some features on here. I never want to compare making a retirement plan to like buying a car, but cars have base models and then they have varying levels of options and different trims and things like that, right? So let's add some features to the plan that may make the plan a little more realistic. Right? One of them is a concept that I love to use with retirees. It's called the discretionary asset fund, AKA the slush fund. So you have choice A on the left. That means all available funds that this client has go into the calculation for Income Lab and show you a monthly value. That is going to yield the highest allowable income, but it's going to yield the least amount of flexibility. So what I say to clients, what if we take a particular amount of assets, whatever that number is, 50,000, 100,000, it really depends on the client and their spending habits, and we remove that and we take it out of the calculation that Income Lab does, and that is a pile of money that you can spend at any time at your discretion, either incrementally or all at once over the course of whatever time period you want, that is not going to impact the monthly Income Lab plan. So that is that's your flexibility. That's your, hey, we want to take a big trip and take all of our family and pay for it and everything like that. That's what the slush fund's for. I'd like to buy a 1967 Camaro or something like that. That's what the slush fund's for, right? So what this does is it mentally lets client like feel, because they do, as if they have some flexibility in their spending. The caveat to this is the slush fund is most likely a use or lose, right? Unless the market is just astronomically good to us, which we all hope. And we might be able to replenish a slush fund if we're above what I'll call the critical path in retirement, where your assets are way higher than where you thought they'd be 3, 4, 5, 10 years in. Then this may be a use or lose, right? But at least that client knows, okay, I have 100 grand in my slush fund. I'm going to take 10 grand out, but I know I have 90. I'm going to take, right? So I think this is a great tool. So next, what I do is I typically just take and copy the plan. So then I say retire 2025, and I keep it real simple. With slush fund, you can type out slush fund, whatever. The client is going to see the title, so might make more sense to type it out. And then there's a couple different ways to achieve like the slush fund, right? One of them is you could just deduct the pre-tax amount of the slush fund from a particular asset they have. That can be good. It can be bad. The reason why that would be bad is that if you end up linking these accounts, so you can actually link accounts from Schwab and custodians and all kind of other software and track the actual values. That's actually the beauty of Income Lab, is that when you link the accounts and implement the plan, it automatically tracks all this for you, including your guardrails, everything like that, right? So another way to do it is to go in, add an expense, right? Just make it a variable expense. Call it slush or whatever you want to call it. Just a regular old other expense. And let's do 50,000 for just the sake of this, right? Make it a one-time expense. And then we want to have it, we're not going to put in the year retirement because that's going to mess up the calculation. So it's kind of something I throw in a year later after. And then if they're using it or not using it, you can kind of kick the can down the road, right? If they don't use any in 25, you move it to 27, and then you decide whether it's adjusted for inflation or not, things like that, right? So we throw that one time in there. We've got our slush fund in there now, all right? And then now let's go ahead and rerun the numbers. So this is saying, okay, if you want the flexibility to be able to have $50,000 that doesn't count towards the income calculation, income lab, that you can spend at your discretion whenever you want, that would take you from 8,900 down to 8,720, right? So what I'm doing here is creating options for the client. I don't like the idea of prescribing a retirement. I like the idea of creating options, educating on them, showing the pros and cons, and letting their personality and their desires and their goals and things like that choose the plan that they think is appropriate, right? So this is one variation of the plan I make. And I'll say, okay, for you to have this slush fund, you're giving up monthly income, but you're also creating this very flexible source of income you can spend anytime. The next variation is say, okay, well, we don't have anything in here to plan for long-term care, right? And there's a lot of ways, I don't say a lot of ways, there's a finite amount of for sure, but there's multiple ways to plan for long-term care. So I just kind of threw 5 options up here that I think are probably the most popular 5. One is do nothing, don't plan for it. That's probably not the best idea, but some clients end up doing it. And my thoughts are, as long as you educate them, tell them that's a bad idea, show them all the other options they have, things like that, and they decide, hey, we're just going to take that risk, then as long as they're educated, that's fine. Although, it's not ideal, but it's fine, right? Yeah, buying long-term care insurance, not going to talk much about that here. I'm personally not the biggest fan of it. I think it does potentially have some benefits, but it's for a smaller subset of clients. You could buy an annuity that has some long-term care protection. I just want to show you an example of that. So here's an annuity that has a health activated multiplier. You can see that they get X amount of dollars here, but if they have a health issue where they can't do 2 of their 6 daily living activities, you've got this activated multiplier that kind of doubles the income for a finite period of time. I would say that in my experience, that alone is not a reason to buy an annuity, but if you're buying one and you're already concerned about long-term care, it might be a good idea to look for one that has that health activated multiplier. There is also the option of using your home equity. Some people open up a line of credit or do something called a HECM, a home equity conversion mortgage, where they say, okay, I have the available equity in my home to pay for long-term care issues if they arise. But if I don't need it, I won't use it and I won't open anything on there. And there's actually a really interesting study, if you ever want to check it out, incorporating home equity into a retirement income strategy. And it's got all kind of cool info about different ways that it was tested of not using home equity, using it sometime, planning on using it in emergencies only. Really cool study. I love to read this stuff. Even if it ends up at the end of it, I say, I'm not doing any of that. At least I ended a little bit smarter. And then we have the self-insure and plan for it in income lab option. So that brings us up to adding another option to income lab, right? So let's say we want to keep the slush fund. And then now on top of that, we want to add some long-term care planning in here. So I'll just rename this Retire 2025 with slush fund and long-term care. Now in these description down here, I could put some more details like $50,000 slush fund, X amount of dollars for X amount of years for long-term care. I think you could do that. For the sake of time, I won't. But it's just kind of showing you that, I like to layer these, to like start with a basic plan and then make it more complex as we go on. And it doesn't mean the client's going to end up choosing the most complex, because they may choose the version with no slush fund, but with long-term care, or with, one and not the other, right? It really depends on them. But what I would do here is I would add another expense, and I would go in to the variable expense, and I would just call this LTC. And we'll just pick one person. We'll call it medical. And let's say we want to do $80,000 a year in today's dollars for 3 years from the end of the plan. All right, just a place to start. You can put whatever value you want in there. I personally, if it's a monthly thing or something that's going to continue, it's not a one-time expense, like to put it in a monthly value because I think it smooths it out a little better. You don't have like these big spikes on an annual value. That's just a personal preference. So I picked $80,000. That's about 6,667 a month for 3 years. So let's go ahead and we'll say that's recurring. It starts from the end of the plan. It goes for 36 months. And we do want to adjust it for inflation because we want it to be $80,000 a year in today's dollars because no doubt those long-term care costs are going to go up. Right? So let's go ahead and add that in and let's run this scenario. And let's see what's happening. And basically what we're doing is we're adding more options, we're adding more flexibility, we're adding more protection, but we're also lowering the monthly amount that they can receive. And clients will look at those and then, we can look at that in aggregate as we're moving through with their retirement planning. Or if you think about this from a prospective client, like you're clearly showing that you're adding value by showing these different variations and these different things that maybe the client may or may not be thinking about. So I think this is a huge, not only a great thing for clients, it's an amazing prospecting tool as well. But you can see adding in those expenses took us down to $86.30 a month after taxes. Relatively small changes because these events, right, like in a long-term care event, we hope, right, is going to be many, many years away. So where it's kind of like when you think about saving, you're making a small change, which compounded over the next 20, 30 years is going to make a big difference. And then it's really easy to show the client visually what this looks like, right? You've got your slush fund right here, which doesn't necessarily mean it's used in 2026. That's just kind of where we placed it. And then you've got your long-term care cost right here. And that goes on for 3 years at the end of the plan, right? So you can show the client, okay, this is visually what this looks like, and this is a really powerful way. You can also show this table down here, which shows all of the spending, the income sources, Social Security, things like that. And then you can see at the end, we've got the, some higher spending because of those long-term care expenses. All right. So now we're thinking about where we're at. We did a basic plan with a slush fund, plan with a slush fund and long-term care expenses. And then now let's add one more thing to it. Let's talk about legacy. I will tell you, this is probably one of the least used features that I have, but some people do want it, so it is important. Most clients that I have don't have a particular legacy goal. They say what's left is left. I raised the kids. I got them through college. I did this. I did that. Let me just leave them whatever happens to be left over. And we're pretty sure something's going to be left over. Right? Kids will end up getting the house most likely, so they get to step up in basis. It's, from a tax perspective, a decent thing to inherit. Also, if we're doing our job in here, and if you watched the last masterclass, which I highly recommend you do, we talked really in depth about taxes. If you're doing systematic Roth conversions from year to year, you're automatically, most likely, building them a tax-free legacy anyway, right? And if they do want to plan for it, of course, you can do that, right? So let's go ahead. Let's make another copy of the plan. I know this seems like, okay, well, we're making multiple copies. How did that? But I think that is, for me, the feedback I've gotten from my clients is they love seeing the different options. They love being able to weigh a reduction in monthly income for added legacy, protection, slush fund, long-term care, whatever that might be. So let's go ahead and we'll call this, and we'll add legacy on here. And then to do that, we go ahead and hit finish. We'll let that think for a minute. And then we're going to come over here and add that legacy in here. And the easiest way I found to have this conversation with clients is, the ones that are very adamant about leaving a particular amount of money to someone, is that how much would that be in today's dollars? Because don't try to think of what it would be in the future. That's almost impossible. But let's go ahead and say, okay, we want to do $500,000 adjusted for inflation for a legacy. So let's go ahead and let's put that in. So we've now got multiple versions of the plan that are progressing and adding different features, which the client may or may not want. And they may say, nope, legacy is not for me. They may say, I'd like to use the home equity option, or I'd like to buy long-term care insurance or whatever instead of planning for it in here. They may say, I don't like the idea of a slush fund because Just knowing my personality type, I may blow it really quick. That happens. Right? But this took down to $82.70 a month after taxes. So you can see income progressively getting lower as we add more features, I'll call it, to the retirement plan. Now, next is really interesting because this is very much a personality thing, is how much you can change the income setting in the software, right? Remember, this is not the aggression or conservatism, whatever, of the portfolio. That's different. That's in a place that you can change an income lab as well. But this is the how aggressive do I want to start with my spending? And if you look as this moves further to the right, the more aggressive you get, you start at a higher value, but you're also very much more likely to hit a guardrail and experience a pay cut. And in my experience, this is better for clients that have a lot of room between their allowable income and their baseline expenses. So let's say I have a client that has no mortgage, no debt. They just basically pay their taxes and their electric bill and things like that. Their allowable income is like 12 grand a month, but their baseline expenses are like 3. Well, they can really start at an aggressive income because them making pay cuts is not going to be detrimental at all to their necessary expenses, right? We're trying to front load their plan, of course, so they can spend, more money, but they're open and willing to making adjustments as they need to ensure that they don't run out, right? Or at least give them the best probability. There's also, the further you move it to the left, the less likely it will be that you hit a downside guardrail, but you're starting at a lower income, right? And this is better for your more conservative spenders, people that fear change. They don't like the idea of this fact of hitting a guardrail sounds terrifying, or they just flat out don't have that much room between their necessary income and their discretionary, right? Like there's not much built into the budget that they can kind of, move around with. So for me, I like to do it. I don't make a new plan for this one, right? I do this live and just kind of show, here's what I like to do, right? So after going through with the client, I'm going to talk to them about their after-tax income. Right? I'm going to say, this is the amount that's deposited in your bank account every month. We're going to go through the cash flows and how you don't get a raise on Social Security and how it works when your mortgage ends and things like that, right? And we're going to go through all kinds of other things in here in a little more detail. But the really important part of this is discussing, okay, how do we protect this plan and what is a guardrail, right? Guardrails are predetermined, and we went through this a lot in Masterclass 1. So please revisit that. Almost the entire thing is about guardrails and protecting plans, right? So the upside guardrail is where the program is basically saying you're not spending enough, at least not for your legacy goals, right? You're probably going to end up with a little too much at the end. You should probably spend more. And the downside guardrail, which as you can see is further away, is where you say, okay, for where you're at right now, we need to take at least a small, most of the time temporary pay cut to be able to sustain our plan and try to make this money last. And a question, answering a previous question, is why such a small change in guardrails? Well, that's because, Justin could probably answer this way better, but if you think about it, when young people start saving, they save small, but you tell them to start early because time's on their side. Well, a pay cut works very similarly, especially in the early years of retirement, where if you take a small one and you're not taking a compounded raise on that, and you're leaving that down for a couple of years, that has an exponential effect when you multiply it over 40-year retirement. So small changes, and especially like not taking a big change all at once and getting accustomed to it. So also answering another previous question is, what happens if you hit a downside guardrail? If you were in this plan and your portfolio fell from the 1.37 million down to this 1.071 million, the program would recommend you take a $370 a month pay cut. Pretty reasonable pay cut compared to the overall income, right? So what that does is it would then reestablish new guardrails, and another drop of whatever magnitude would be necessary for you to possibly take another pay cut. So it's trying to prevent big changes in their life, give time to get used to it, time for the market to maybe recover or things to change, right? So to answer that previous question is, small changes make a big difference. And yes, it will recalculate new guardrails if you do hit one, right? But the important thing about this is you can show clients live time what changing their spending aggression, I'll call it, right? Income, income front loading, if you will. So if we take this and we front load more, so we're moving more to the right, you can see what happens, right? The income goes up. I'm going to go back just one more time. Look right here at the income and then look at the guardrails. The income goes up. The upside guardrail goes up. So it would take more to get a raise from there. And the downside guardrail comes up, meaning that you're closer to a potential pay cut. You're starting at a higher income, but you're closer to a pay cut. An interesting thing is a lot of clients do, if they do share concerns about medical and long-term care costs and things like that, is they tend to be either moderate or like further to the left of the scale, where if you plan for those long-term care costs in the plan, you can actually get them to move that scale to the right, because then they know that they've got it in the plan, right? So let's move this more aggressively over, and you can kind of see how it responds, in that you're starting now at the highest income you could start at, but your downside guardrails is, it's 18% away. That's not like right around the corner, but it's definitely closer than this 22% guardrail. Or if you took this all the way down to the lower end, this 28% guardrail, right? So that's really, I'd say, a personality thing, right? That's going to be client to client, what they're comfortable with. I can always give recommendations. I'm like, well, let's build in a slush fund. Let's build in long-term care costs. Let's build in all these things, but then let's slide that sliding scale a little further to the right, because we have all that stuff built in. That's how I like to do it, right? But you can see it dynamically changes, so you can go over this with clients and you can make either a lifetime decision, or at least give them something to think about as to whether or not they should be front loading more, keeping it more moderate, or I'll call it back loading a little bit more. Our goal, in my opinion, is to try to get them to at least stay moderate, or preferably to front load as much as they're comfortable with. Just going back to the concept of spending more early, you don't get your time back, right? Like, those things are very important. And overwhelmingly, if you look at retirees that are surveyed in their 70s and 80s, their overwhelming response is, I wish I would have done more. It's not, I wish I would have spent less. There are some of that. All right, so if we're looking at that, now it's like, okay, so this is answering a previous question too, is how do you present this? Like, now that you've made these plans, and to be honest with you, I don't present via a plan or anything like that. You can see I've got all these variations, and I'm just going to tell them, I'll show you real quick, like, this is where I present. It's a very conversational type of room. I've found that, in my opinion, it's more effective for me, at least, and my clients, than a sitting across the desk, authoritative type of turn your monitor to the right. We got a big TV. Of course, being a nuke, I've got to have the lamp that looks like an atom. How can you not have that? And then I've got our client sitting here. I've got my laptop out, and I'm just showing them on the screen and walking through the income lab plan. All right. Not making any type of PowerPoint, anything like that. Of course, when they walk in, I'll have a customized picture and their name. So welcome. I just keep a PowerPoint on the desktop. And this is Peach Bottom. This is the nuclear power plant I worked at for a very long time. But if they're just from around, local, I'll just keep like a picture of Bel Air, which is where my office is, or whatever. You can customize that however you want. But you see, you now have multiple plans. And I like to go through and I like to present. I'll present the basic plan in detail, right? And I think we've got time, so I can kind of go through that, right? I'll start out with the client and just going through and verifying all of these numbers. Like, there's this much in your 401k, things like that. You'd be surprised, or maybe not, at things that clients may forget or didn't tell you. Hey, I've also got this taxable account. I've also got this. I've also got that, right? So just kind of going through each thing, validating. It's a double, triple check with the client to make sure that everything that is in here is accurate, right? And then I'll say, as this is calculating, what it's doing is it's looking through historical data, and it's doing Justin's magic formulas and things like that. And it's going to determine what a reasonable starting income would be. And then I always speak in after taxes in today's dollars. I think that's the most relatable, because I'm not really like, don't enjoy like trying to micromanage anybody's budget or finances or anything. I'd like to say, if you made X amount of dollars bring home from your job, and you could bring home X amount of dollars in retirement, and those two numbers are the same, do you think you'd be happy? And most of the time, it's an overwhelming yes. Right? So we'll go through that. We'll go through the cash flow chart, of course, because I want them to see the visual of this. Right? We'll definitely test the plan, right? And testing the plan, as I say, like, this is not just doing where it's going to say X probability of, success or anything like that. We talk about that a lot in Masterclass 1, but it's going to be more of what's the probability you may have to make an income change at some time throughout your retirement based on some historical data. All right. So this takes a little long. So at this point, I'm talking to them. I'm saying, so what this is doing is it's running your retirement through X number of different variations and things like that. You can see that based on your experience, there's an 88% chance that you're going to experience these events, right? Nothing but raises throughout time. And there is a 12% chance of potentially hitting a guardrail. And I say, most importantly, 12% is not a insignificant number. That means that, 12 out of 100 people will experience this. So if I have 100 clients, 12 may experience it, right? It doesn't really work like that, but you can at least, kind of present in that manner. But the most important thing to say is if you had a take-home income of $8,900 a month, right, and you had to take a pay cut of this, let's just call it $400 a month, would that 8,900 minus 400 taking you down to 8,500, would that materially change your quality of life? Or could you still be very comfortable with the life that you're living? Most people overwhelmingly, like, I wouldn't even notice the difference. And I say, okay, well, that you're probably a good candidate to continue with retirement planning. If they say that $500 a month pay cut would put me really close to my budget or my bills, well, I'd say maybe we should reevaluate working a little longer or working part-time or doing something else, right? So it's also a good gauge of how the client feels about their finances, how much room they have in their discretionary versus their baseline spending, things like that, right? Always want to show them this. This is, historical analysis. Does it make sense? Or I'm sorry, does it, if you're going through and you had started your retirement through in different time periods, above the blue line is nothing but raises, and this is what you could have spent. Below the blue line means you probably would have hit a guardrail, and it's not too much of a surprise when that happened before the Great Depression and the Great Inflation, right? Not a surprise, but again, you can go back to the guardrail and say, if that happened and you had to take this pay cut, would that be detrimental, right? So then after like an in-depth presentation of the first plan, then I'll say, okay, this is, and I do kind of preface this with saying, this is going to be the highest plan, so don't get too excited yet. We're going to go through some different options that are going to lower the amount, but also add some flexibility and some protection. And then I'll go through, and I don't recap the entire plan. I just go to the next one and say, okay, what if we add a slush fund? I show them how we do it, and then I show them the change in income. And then I move on to the next one, so on and so forth. Right? Another thing I wanted to touch on is, annuities, right? There is an annuity feature in here. We got a question in one of the previous about like, how does that work? I'm not pro annuity. I'm not anti annuity. I would say a very small percentage of my clients have annuities because it made sense for them. And here's kind of where I think it made sense. They're very risk averse, but don't realize the amount of risk they have in bonds, right? 2022 showed us that. They want a guaranteed income for them or their surviving spouse. Or if you can get them guaranteed income, could you get them to invest the remaining more aggressively? Like, so if they would otherwise have cash in the mattress or under the mattress, and getting some guaranteed income or some stability in there could allow them to invest. Well, I think at that point, you're giving them a better opportunity to work against inflation, right? So I did kind of throw two things together. I'm going to show these real quick just for the sake of time. But this is plan one, where you had a client that was all in cash and bonds. I know that I have run across this. It's not, it does happen. And you can see the allowable income. And then you can see much lower probability of, as far as, or higher probability of taking pay cuts, a lower probability of going through retirement without, mostly because of the risk of inflation and cash just not keeping up with the cost of living, right? So then you can model and say, okay, what if we put a portion of that in an annuity? Maybe you could do some portion in a fixed or a RILA, or some portion in a SPIA and some portion in a variable, something, still maintain relatively conservative compared to the general population. But what if we could get a little more income, but then a higher probability or a lower probability of taking a pay cut? So this is not a plug for annuities, and Income Lab by far is not like an annuity software. It's really just like if a client, if it's right for them, let's say they would otherwise be in all cash or otherwise be in very conservative investments, it may be something to check out, and you can run the side by side and show them. And if our goal, or if we're able to get them invested more aggressively than they otherwise would have been, but still kind of sleep okay at night, I think we did our job. There's an interesting study about that. It's about the combination of stocks and bonds versus stocks and a SPIA. This is pretty cool stuff. Highly recommend checking it out. There's the title. Good stuff. But let's go ahead, and I think it's probably time to open up for Q&A and stuff like that. I went through a lot. I know it went very fast. Like I said, the good people at Income Lab will show you everything in depth. I think maybe one more thing I'd like to show you, just one more. And this is what I send either prospective clients or clients after our first meeting, where we go, and that's not necessarily the first meeting, but the first meeting in which we go through all of those variations of the plan. I do send them a pretty templated recap email. It defines those features. So it defines the slush fund again, defines the long-term care, it defines the legacy. That's just boilerplate. We may change the amounts and stuff in there. And then it recaps very simply the retirement income with each of those things in there. And you see, I didn't put the rest of them in. I just kind of started with one, and then you can fill those in as you see fit. But that's a great way to like send them the overview. I think most of the time clients or prospective clients are a little overwhelmed after that big presentation, but it definitely shows your value and expertise. So this is a good way to recap. I'm not sharing plans at this point with them because I think it's too early. I would like them to choose, and we reduce and put some features in there that we talked about, and also start to add things like, every 5 years buy a car, every, do this, annual gifting to kids, the details I was talking about. That's when you start to get the chisel on the ice sculpture. So enough of me grandstanding. I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. Justin, go ahead.
That was awesome, Ryan. I got tons of questions. Kind of sticking to that last thing you were talking about, the meeting you just went through, the email and so on, is that like, where does that sit in, like, imagine this were a prospect. Is that something you do for them? Are they first kind of signing on as a client? How does that whole flow work?
That's a great question, and it's very dependent on where I think the relationship's going to go. Because I have a very warm referral system, there's a high probability of somebody, if they come in and I show them all these things, that they're most likely going to become a client. I'm not afraid to do all this up front before any agreements or fees or anything like that, in anticipation that what I show them is going to be kind of like a wow factor, and that they are going to want to become a client. Because showing them these things with their retirement income, things like that, are not giving away the keys to the kingdom. It's really just showing them what you're going to do. But somebody has to monitor this. Somebody has to do the guardrails. Somebody has to establish a slush fund, right. So it's really just kind of previewing, especially when you get into the taxes. And if you haven't watched Masterclass 2, please do it, because that by far, when you present that part of it during the prospect meeting, and I'm going to do that next Masterclass for sure, that is probably raises your probability of acquiring that client by 100% at that point. Like, not to 100%, but by 100%, if that math works. So I do this relatively early for a lot of prospective clients in anticipation that they'll become a client. The risk of that is that you put some time in that otherwise maybe you wouldn't have, but it also shows a ton of value. And as you saw, I created 5 of these plans live in front of you. It doesn't take all that long.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if you run into this, but if you ever have clients who aren't particularly confident about retiring, or, feeling a little nervous about it, reluctant to spend and so on, what do you dive into there to help them kind of feel confident and go for it?
The biggest thing I think that gets people comfortable with spending is showing them the guardrails, because I think the uncertainty of probability of success maybe does create a lot of that fear. Like if I tell a client they've got an 80% chance and they're an engineer, they're automatically thinking what happens the other 20%. That's like instantly. Where if I'm saying, well, you could spend this much, and if something happens, then we're going to take this pay cut. And then by the way, let's go ahead and stress test your plan. Now, this is the annuity plan, so it's not going to look great. Let's stress test your plan and see if you had gone through some of these different events in history, how would it have actually held up? That actual, like, here's what it is. Here's your predefined pay cut. Here is like all these things instead of the uncertainty of 80% versus 76 versus that inherently, I think, does allow people to spend a little bit more.
I hadn't thought about that, but the Monte Carlo probability of success, my understanding is that was heavily used in nuclear in nuclear for the bomb, right? And that's just a totally different use than for retirement income planning. And so, yeah, you're right. You definitely wouldn't want to bring that up. I mean, I don't think you should bring it up with most people, but that actually brings up, we've had a bunch of questions about the whole, like, well, actually, how do you get to that number? We talked about that a ton in Masterclass 1. There, I think, are other webinars that we've done. And there's also an article on kitces.com that I wrote about how it's all about making sure people are living within their means. That's really what it's about. So you don't want to live well below your means, unless that just happens to be how you live your life, right? You don't want to be unnecessarily being frugal if you don't want to. And you also don't want to live above your means. And so that's what it's all about. We're trying to find a spending level that is neither overspending nor underspending, right? It's a balance. And the guardrails are there, that there's an overspending guardrail and an underspending guardrail. I mean, that's really what those are. The green one is an underspending guardrail. You're spending too little. How about you live a little? And the red one says, things are starting to look a little overheated here. So I
think that's the importance of, one is have them compare their take-home income while they're working to their take-home income in retirement, because that will tell you if someone is struggling, if a family's struggling, paying, kind of paycheck to paycheck while they're working, and their income is going to be the same in retirement, most likely they're going to struggle in retirement also. So that's a little bit of a warning flag. If you show them the predicted possible pay cut from the guardrails, and they kind of give you ooh, that would hurt, which would be a little concerning, right? Because the pay cuts are relatively small. I mean, they're about 5% ballpark, right? Yeah. That could be a trigger that maybe they shouldn't be retiring, or that we should work part-time or do something. So I think doing those exercises, and then also building in the slush fund, right? If they blow through their slush fund in the first year or two, you haven't impacted their plan at all because it was already out of that. But you can have a conversation with them saying, hey, that slush fund was supposed to be probably for the first 10 years of your retirement when you're really mobile. You've already gone through it. We can't spend any more. So that does give you a little more protection while giving them flexibility and giving them protection as well.
Yeah, I think you handled the question about the size of that reduction really well. I think all those things are to play an important role. And like you said, this is an annuity plan, so maybe you're not going to see one with lots of downward adjustments, but you can even find in the retirement stress test sometimes, usually the worst scenarios are like Great Depression or stagflation is what I find. Maybe you'll see one with a couple of red lines, right? And so you could show somebody, well, look, things could potentially someday. There you go. Be bad enough that you'd have to take 2 pay cuts, maybe relatively closely to each other. We just don't want to overreact, right? You don't want to get whipsawed by taking a 20% pay cut when it actually turns out all you needed was 5, right? So that's so much of what that's based on.
So here's where you can show a prospective or a client, and you say, you just retired. Imagine you're retired, January 2025. 2008 starts in February of 2025. Worst timing you could ever have to be a retiree. You can't control that timing. It just is what it is, right? You can't control what happens after you retire. If that happened and you had to take these 2 pay cuts back to back, and you had to go from $8,900 a month down to $7,900 a month, which you've already expressed that your bare minimum bills are $3,500 or $4,000 a month. So we know that you can at least definitely pay the essentials and still maintain. And you had to do that for a finite period of time. See how these greens allow you to get your money back? Would that be detrimental to your quality of life? And would that keep you from retiring? And typically, if you phrase it like that, the answer is no.
Yeah. We did have a question. I actually, it's one I haven't gotten a lot, which is, do you ever run into people who, well, I mean, the question was, how are you getting to this spending level? But they mentioned, is there some sort of like, don't dip into principal kind of thing going on here? And the answer is no. I mean, if you didn't want to dip into principal, you'd have to set that nice big legacy goal saying, hey, no, I want to leave all this behind. By the way, that doesn't mean you'll never dip into principal. It just means you'll behave in a way that'll give you a really good chance of not dipping into principal. But do you run into that with people ever? They say, oh, I only want to spend, the growth on this account. And how do you talk them into more of a, use all your resources approach?
It's really like I show them the numbers that it would look like if they only lived off their interest.
Yeah.
And typically that's not enough to sustain it's not what they want, right? If they look at that actual interest and they're like, ooh, that's not really what I thought. I say, well, yeah, well, you're being extremely conservative just by trying to maintain your principal. And usually we try to dig into why. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to leave this big IRA to your child or children? What's the reason for that? And they may have a very good reason for that. Or the reason may just be like, well, it's a safety thing. I'd like to maintain that. Well, I'm like, well, let's build some other features into here for safety. Let's put the long-term care costs in. Let's put the slush fund. Let's put some type of legacy, not the full principal. Let's put something. Let's do systematic Roth conversion. So we're leaving them a Roth IRA and a house versus a big IRA, which is going to be taxed like crazy, right? So those things do help a ton. But usually if you show them the amount of income they actually would be living off of if they're just trying to maintain the principal, they're not happy with that. And then we're able to come to some type of medium. Most people don't even think about the fact that they're leaving their kids their house and it's going to be most of the time relatively tax-free, or that if they're doing Roth conversions, that's going to be tax-free, right? So if you show them that, it typically does allow them to get a little more comfortable with spending. But some people are just at the end of the day are just going to say, I'm not touching my principal. And I'll just say there's usually just not much you can do with that, except for the fact of just show them, like, here's how much you're giving up in your life for that. And if there's not like this great reason to leave the kids this massive pile of money, I will try to show them everything I can to try to get them to spend.
Yeah. And we're pretty much in the last minute here. We had a couple questions on asset allocation, investment performance, things like that. Do you, build your own models in Income Lab? Do you use the preset defaults? How much do you talk about that? I know you had an example there with, using all bonds, so you did already cover that a bit, but maybe address that just briefly.
Yeah, I like to build my own models, but I keep it pretty simple. Our investment philosophy is, relatively passive. We do put some things in the, that we think are good hedges and stuff like that. Not to get too much in investments, but I don't get too crazy with the investments. So therefore, I also don't have to get too crazy with the custom allocations like I'm building inside of Income Lab. And then along with that, we do use Income Lab because it's great. And I'm going to show you this in Masterclass 4 to build what's called a liability driven or a time segmentation, also known as a bucket strategy type of portfolio, which is another great way to get people to invest more aggressively than they otherwise would have, because you're speaking in number of years you can cover in retirement income rather than 60-40. So we're gonna cover that in a lot more detail in episode 4. But I don't get too crazy with the investments because we also don't invest very. It's relatively straightforward and passive from a firm perspective, right?
Awesome. Well, this is another great session, Ryan. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for those of you where we didn't get to your questions. We'll try to take a look through them, kind of like Ryan did this time, and make sure we address them where we can in the session 2 weeks from now. But thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you all again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Have a good one. Thanks, Justin.